The train whistle echoed across the empty plains as the afternoon sun beat down on Millbrook Station. Margaret Whitfield stepped off the dusty wooden platform, her worn leather boots clicking against the weathered boards. She clutched her carpet bag, tightly in one hand and a crumpled telegram in the other. At 42, Margaret had traveled over 800 miles from Ohio, carrying nothing but hope and the promise of a new life with a man she had never met. Her gray dress, carefully mended and pressed for this important day, already showed signs of the long journey. Dust from the train settled on her dark hair, which she had pinned back neatly despite the wisps that escaped in the prairie wind. Margaret looked around the small station, searching for the face she had only seen in a faded photograph. The telegram in her hand was from Robert Coleman, a merchant who had advertised for a wife in the newspaper back home. His letters had been kind, if brief, describing his general store and his need for a companion. Margaret had responded honestly about her age and appearance, but perhaps her words had painted a picture different from reality. She spotted a well-dressed man near the station house checking his pocket watch with obvious impatience. Margaret approached him carefully, her heart beating faster with each step. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Coleman?" she asked, her voice steady despite her nervousness. The man looked up and Margaret saw his expression change immediately. His eyes moved, from her face to her graying hair, then down to her simple dress and worn shoes. The smile that had started to form on his lips faded quickly. "You're the woman from Ohio?" he asked, making no effort to hide his disappointment. "Yes, I'm Margaret Whitfield. I believe you're expecting me." Robert Coleman took a step back, shaking his head. "The photograph you sent, it must have been taken many years ago. You're much older than I expected, much older than you described in your letters." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her voice calm. "I told you my age clearly in my second letter, Mr. Coleman. I'm 42 years old." 42? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You look 50 if you're a day. I asked for a wife, not a grandmother." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she refused to let this stranger see her pain. She had faced disappointment before. She had watched younger women marry while she remained alone. She had nursed her sick mother for years, giving up her own chances at love. But this public rejection after traveling so far and spending her precious savings cut deeper than she expected. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "Then I suppose there's been a misunderstanding?" "More than a misunderstanding," Robert replied, already turning away. "I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, but I can't marry someone who misrepresented herself so badly." With that, he walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone on the platform as the train pulled away behind her. She watched his retreating figure until he disappeared around the corner of the station house. Only then did she allow herself to sit down heavily on a wooden bench, still clutching her bag and the now meaningless telegram. The station began to empty as other passengers were met by family or friends. A young couple embraced nearby, the man spinning his bride around as she laughed with joy. An elderly farmer helped his wife down from the train, their grown children rushing to greet them. Everyone seemed to have someone waiting for them. Everyone except Margaret. As the sun moved lower in the sky, Margaret tried to think practically about her situation. She had spent most of her savings on the train ticket and had only a few dollars left in her small purse. The next train back to Ohio wouldn't come for 3 days, and she couldn't afford a ticket anyway. She had no family left back home, no job waiting for her. She had given up everything for this chance at a new life. The station master, a kindly older man with a gray beard, approached her as he began closing up the building. "Miss, are you waiting for someone?" he asked gently. "No," Margaret replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "No, I don't believe I am anymore. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight? There's a boarding house in town, but it's a fair walk from here." Margaret counted the coins in her purse. She had enough for perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house, but then what? She couldn't impose on strangers indefinitely, and she had no skills that would easily translate to work in this small frontier town. "I'll manage," she said, not wanting to burden this stranger with her problems. The station master looked at her, with concern, but he had his own responsibilities. He tipped his hat and wished her well before heading home to his own family. Margaret sat alone as darkness began to fall over the prairie. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and cattle. In the distance, she could see the warm glow of windows in the small town, families gathering for dinner and evening conversations. She felt more alone than she ever had in her life. That's when she heard the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road. A man was loading supplies from the platform into his wagon, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone used to hard work. Margaret watched him from her bench, noting his tall frame and the gentle way he handled even the heavy sacks of grain. Thomas Brennan had come to town for monthly supplies, the same trip he'd made dozens of times since his wife died 3 years ago. He loaded flour, coffee, and other necessities into his wagon, while his mind wandered to the evening chores waiting at home. It was only when he reached for the last sack that he noticed the woman sitting alone on the bench. Something about her posture caught his attention. She sat straight and dignified despite her obvious distress. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she stared out at the horizon with the look of someone trying very hard to be brave. Thomas had seen that expression before, in his own mirror during the darkest days after his wife's death. He finished loading his wagon but found himself glancing back at the woman several times. She didn't move from the bench, didn't seem to have anywhere to go. The temperature was dropping as night fell, and Thomas knew the prairie could be unforgiving to someone unprepared for its harsh conditions. Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you waiting for someone?" Margaret looked up at him, seeing a man perhaps a few years older than herself. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. There was something gentle about his manner that made her feel safe, even in her vulnerable state. "No," she said simply. "I don't believe anyone is coming for me." Thomas heard the story behind those few words, even though she didn't tell it. He had lived long enough to recognize heartbreak when he saw it. "My name is Thomas Brennan. I have a ranch about an hour's ride from here. My housekeeper makes the best coffee in 3 counties, and there's always room at our table for someone in need." Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign of false kindness or hidden motives. But Thomas's offer seemed genuine, made with the same natural generosity she had seen in truly good people throughout her life. "I wouldn't want to impose," she said carefully. "No imposition," Thomas replied. "We've all needed help from strangers at one time or another. Besides, Mrs. Chen would never forgive me if I left a lady stranded at the station." Margaret made her decision. She had little choice, really, but something about this quiet rancher made her feel that accepting his help wouldn't compromise her dignity. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Brennan. I'm Margaret Whitfield." As Thomas helped her up into the wagon seat, Margaret felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced since stepping off the train. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, she wouldn't be alone on the prairie. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as they rolled along the dirt road leading away from town. Margaret sat beside Thomas on the wooden seat, her carpet bag at her feet, and her hands folded in her lap. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but she felt she should explain her situation to this kind stranger who had offered her shelter. "I suppose you're wondering why I was sitting alone at the station," Margaret said quietly, watching the prairie grass bend in the evening breeze. Thomas glanced at her sideways, noting the careful way she chose her words. "Only if you want to tell me. Sometimes a person needs time before they're ready to talk about their troubles." His gentle response made Margaret's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. It had been so long since anyone had shown her simple kindness without expecting something in return. "I came here to marry a man I'd never met," she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. "He took one look at me and decided I wasn't what he wanted. Said I was too old, that I'd misrepresented myself in my letters." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of someone treating this dignified woman so cruelly. "That says more about his character than yours, ma'am. A decent man doesn't abandon someone who's traveled so far on his account." Margaret turned to study his profile as he spoke. There was genuine indignation in his voice, as if her mistreatment had personally offended him. "You're very kind to say so, but perhaps he was right. Perhaps I was foolish to think that someone would want to marry a woman my age. Foolish? Thomas shook his head. There's nothing foolish about hoping for companionship. We all need someone to share our days with. Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more closely. She heard the loneliness beneath his words, a loneliness that matched her own. As they rode, Thomas found himself sharing more than he usually did with strangers. I lost my wife 3 years ago. Helen was her name. She got sick one winter and just never got better. The house has been mighty quiet since then. I'm sorry for your loss, Margaret said softly. 3 years is still fresh grief. Some days it feels like yesterday, others like a lifetime ago, Thomas admitted. Strange how grief works. You think you're doing fine, then something small hits you and you're right back in that dark place. Margaret nodded, understanding more than he knew. I lost my mother 2 years ago. She was sick for a long time and I took care of her. By the time she passed, most of my friends had married and moved away. I found myself alone in a house full of memories. They talked quietly as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret learned that Thomas raised cattle on a ranch he'd built with his own hands. He had 2 ranch hands who helped with the heavy work, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Chen who had worked for the family since before Helen's death. Mrs. Chen is getting older, though, Thomas said. She's been talking about moving to San Francisco to live with her daughter. Can't say I blame her. Ranch life is hard on everyone, but especially on someone her age. What will you do when she leaves? Margaret asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I honestly don't know. I can cook beans and bacon well enough, but beyond that, he shrugged. I suppose I'll figure something out. When they reached the ranch, Margaret saw a modest but well-built house surrounded by several outbuildings. Even in the fading light, she could see that everything was neat and well-maintained. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, and she could hear horses moving in the corral behind the barn. Mrs. Chen came out to greet them, a small woman with graying hair and curious eyes. Thomas introduced Margaret and briefly explained her situation. Mrs. Chen listened without judgment, then immediately bustled Margaret into the house. You must be tired and hungry, Mrs. Chen said, leading Margaret to a comfortable chair by the Kier fireplace. I'll heat some stew and make fresh coffee. Thomas, you bring in her bag and then wash up for dinner. The inside of the house surprised Margaret with its warmth and comfort. The furniture was simple but well made, and she could see Helen's touch in the embroidered cushions and carefully arranged photographs. It was clearly the home of people who had loved each other and built a life together. Over dinner, Margaret learned more about ranch life. Thomas explained how he'd started with just a few head of cattle and slowly built his herd over the years. The work was hard but rewarding, and he clearly took pride in what he'd accomplished. Do you miss teaching? Mrs. Chen asked Margaret, who had mentioned her former occupation. Every day, Margaret replied honestly. I loved working with children, seeing them discover new ideas and watching their faces light up when they finally understood something difficult. The children around here don't have much schooling, Thomas said thoughtfully. The nearest school is in town, too far for most ranch families to send their little ones every day. Some of the neighbors have talked about starting something closer, but we'd need someone qualified to teach. Margaret felt a spark of interest. How many children are we talking about? Maybe 15 or 20, counting all the ranch families within riding distance, Thomas said, ages from about 6 to 14. As they continued talking, Margaret began to see possibilities she hadn't considered. These were good people living hard but honest lives. They faced real challenges but worked together to solve them. It was different from the life she'd known in Ohio, but perhaps different could be better. After dinner, Mrs. Chen showed Margaret to a small but comfortable guest room. You rest now, the older woman said kindly. Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next. But Margaret found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window looking out at the star-filled sky, thinking about the day's events. This morning she had been a rejected mail-order bride with nowhere to go. Tonight she was a welcomed guest in the home of people who treated her with respect and kindness. She thought about Thomas's gentle manner and the way he'd defended her without even knowing her whole story. She remembered how his face had lit Up when she talked about teaching and how he'd mentioned the local children's need for education. Most of all, she thought about the loneliness she'd heard in his voice when he talked about his empty house and quiet evenings. It was a loneliness she understood completely. The next morning, Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and joined Thomas and Mrs. Chen for breakfast. The conversation was easy and comfortable, as if she'd been part of their household for years rather than hours. "I've been thinking," Margaret said as they finished eating, "about what you said last night, about needing help when Mrs. Chen leaves." Thomas looked up from his coffee cup, surprised by her directness. "I'm a good cook and housekeeper," Margaret continued. "I can manage a household budget and I'm not afraid of hard work. If you'd be willing to hire me, I could stay on as your housekeeper, at least until you find someone more permanent." Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly, but Thomas looked uncertain. "I wouldn't want you to feel like you're settling for less than you deserve," he said carefully. "Mr. Brennan," Margaret said, meeting his eyes directly. "Yesterday I had nothing and nowhere to go. Today I'm sitting in a warm kitchen with kind people, discussing honest work that would give me purpose and dignity. That doesn't sound like settling to me." Thomas studied her face, seeing the determination and quiet strength there. "The work is hard and the pay wouldn't be much." "I don't need much," Margaret replied. "Just a fair wage, a decent place to live, and the chance to be useful again." After a long moment, Thomas nodded. "If you're sure that's what you want, we'd be glad to have you." As Margaret shook hands with her new employer, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she was exactly where she belonged. The first week at the ranch passed quickly for Margaret. She threw herself into her new role with determination, wanting to prove that Thomas had made the right decision in hiring her. The house had been well maintained by Mrs. Chen, but Margaret could see areas where a woman's touch had been missing since Helen's death. She started with the kitchen, organizing the pantry and cleaning out cupboards that hadn't been thoroughly scrubbed in months. The curtains throughout the house were faded and dusty, so Margaret took them down and washed them carefully, mending small tears and pressing them until they looked fresh again. Thomas watched her work with quiet appreciation. He had grown accustomed to living in a house that was clean but somehow lifeless. Margaret brought energy back to the rooms, humming softly as she worked and filling the air with the sense of baking bread and simmering stew. "You don't have to do all this extra work," he told her one morning as she scrubbed the kitchen floor, on her hands and knees. Margaret looked up at him, a strand of hair falling across her face. "I know I don't have to, but a house should feel like a home, don't you think? Besides, it feels good to be useful again." Thomas helped her to her feet, noticing how her cheeks were flushed from the work and how her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. Helen used to say the same thing about making a house into a home. Instead of the sharp pain he usually felt when mentioning his late wife, Thomas found the memory brought him comfort. Margaret didn't try to change the subject or offer empty sympathy. She simply nodded, understanding that some memories were too precious to avoid. By the second week, Margaret had established a routine that worked for everyone. She rose early to start breakfast and pack lunches for Thomas and the ranch hands. During the day, while the men worked with the cattle, she tended to the house and started a small vegetable garden behind the kitchen. The garden had been Helen's project originally, but it had been neglected since her death. Margaret found the old tools in the shed and spent hours clearing weeds and preparing the soil. She planted herbs and vegetables, talking to Mrs. Chen about what grew best in the harsh prairie climate. "You have good hands for growing things," Mrs. Chen observed one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. Helen would be happy to see her garden alive again. Margaret paused in her weeding, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I hope so. I'd hate to think I was overstepping." "You're not overstepping," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You're living. There's a difference." In the evenings, Margaret discovered that Thomas enjoyed reading. His small collection of books was well worn, and she could see he'd read each one multiple times. When she mentioned that she had been forced to sell most of her books before leaving Ohio, Thomas offered to share his library. They began spending their evenings in the sitting room, reading by lamplight. Sometimes they would discuss what they were reading, sharing thoughts about the stories or ideas they encountered. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's company. "I never thought I'd find someone who enjoys books as much as I do," Thomas said one night as they both looked up from their reading. "Most people think reading is a waste of time," Margaret replied. "But I've always believed that books can take you places you'd never otherwise see." "Helen used to read to me sometimes," Thomas said quietly. "I enjoyed listening to her voice as much as the stories themselves." Margaret set down her book and looked at him thoughtfully. "Would you like me to read aloud? I used to read to my students, and my mother always said I had a pleasant voice for it." From that night on, they took turns reading to each other. Margaret's voice was indeed pleasant, warm and expressive as she brought characters to life. Thomas's voice was deeper, more measured, but equally soothing. The evening readings became a treasured part of their routine. As the weeks passed, Margaret noticed changes in Thomas. The deep lines around his eyes seemed less pronounced, and he smiled more often. He began sharing stories about his life with Helen, not with the desperate sadness of early grief, but with the gentle fondness of someone learning to treasure memories without being trapped by them. Margaret, too, felt herself changing. The constant worry that had plagued her in Ohio began to fade. She slept better and found herself laughing at Thomas's dry sense of humor. She realized she had been lonely for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to share the small moments of daily life. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Thomas asked about her life before coming to Montana. "I was engaged once," Margaret said, surprising herself with the admission. "His name was William, and he worked at the textile mill. We were planning to marry the following spring, but there was an accident at the factory. He was killed along with several other men." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "How long ago was that?" 15 years, Margaret said softly. "I was 27 then, old enough that people expected me to find someone else quickly, but I couldn't seem to move forward. Then my mother got sick, and taking care of her became my whole life." "Do you regret not marrying someone else?" Thomas asked gently. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I used to think I did. I used to lie awake wondering what my life would have been like if I'd been braver, if I'd opened my heart to someone new. But now—" She paused, looking out at the vast prairie. "Now I think maybe everything happened the way it was supposed to. If I'd married someone else, I wouldn't be here now." Their conversations grew deeper and more personal as trust built between them. Thomas told Margaret about the early days of building the ranch, the lean years when he and Helen had eaten beans and cornbread for weeks at a time. Margaret shared her memories of teaching, the joy she'd found in helping children discover their own capabilities. "I miss it," she admitted one day, as they worked together in the garden. "Teaching, I mean. There's something special about seeing a child's face light up when they finally understand something they've been struggling with." Thomas straightened up from the tomato plants he'd been staking. "I've been thinking about what you said before, about the children around here not having proper schooling." "Oh? What if we started a school here? Nothing fancy, just a one-room schoolhouse where the ranch children could come a few days a week. Would you be interested in teaching again?" Margaret's heart leaped at the suggestion. "Do you really think it would work?" "I think it would work beautifully," Thomas said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We could build a small schoolhouse on the property, close enough that you could walk there but far enough from the main house to give the children proper learning space." That evening, they discussed the idea in detail. They would need to talk to the neighboring families, determine how many children would attend, and figure out what supplies would be needed. But the more they talked, the more excited they both became about the project. "You know," Thomas said as they planned, "Helen always wanted children. We tried for years, but it never happened. She would have loved this idea, bringing children's voices to the ranch." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "I think she would be proud of you for thinking of it." As summer approached, Margaret realized that she no longer thought of herself as Thomas's temporary housekeeper. Somewhere along the way, without either of them speaking of it directly, She had become his partner in running the household and planning for the future. They made decisions together, shared responsibilities, and had created a comfortable life that satisfied them both. But she also noticed something else growing between them, something neither of them had acknowledged aloud. In the gentle way Thomas helped her carry heavy baskets, in the lingering moments when their hands touched as they passed dishes at dinner, in the way they had begun sitting closer together during their evening readings, Margaret sensed that their relationship was quietly deepening into something more than friendship and partnership. She wasn't sure if Thomas felt it too, and she was afraid to assume too much. After all, she was still the woman who had been rejected at the train station, still the spinster who had given up on love. But in the quiet moments of their shared days, Margaret began to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth staying for. Summer arrived with blazing heat and endless blue skies. Margaret had been at the ranch for nearly 4 months, and the rhythm of their days had become as natural as breathing. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, spending her mornings tending the thriving garden and managing the household. Thomas worked long days with the cattle, coming home dusty and tired but always with a smile for her. It was during these summer evenings that Margaret began to notice small changes in Thomas's behavior. He started lingering at the kitchen table after dinner, reluctant to end their conversations. When she worked in the garden, he found excuses to join her, claiming he needed to check the fence or repair a tool shed that seemed to function perfectly well. One evening, as Margaret hung laundry on the line behind the house, she found a small bouquet of wildflowers tucked into her apron pocket, prairie roses and Indian paintbrush tied with a piece of string. She looked around but saw no sign of who had placed them there, though she noticed Thomas whistling as he worked in the barn, something he hadn't done since she'd known him. The flowers appeared again a few days later, this time on her windowsill when she woke in the morning. Yellow sunflowers and purple lupine, picked fresh with the morning dew still on their petals. Margaret pressed them carefully in her Bible, treasure each simple gift while wondering if she was reading too much into Thomas's kindness. Their evening reading sessions had evolved into something more intimate. They sat closer now, sometimes sharing the same book, their shoulders touching as they read. When Margaret read aloud, Thomas would watch her face instead of following along in the text, his expression soft and thoughtful. One particularly warm evening, they decided to sit on the porch instead of inside. The air was still and heavy, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Margaret was mending one of Thomas's shirts, her needle moving steadily in the lamplight, when she felt his eyes on her. "What is it?" she asked, looking up from her work. "I was just thinking how peaceful this is," Thomas said quietly. "How right it feels, having you here." Margaret set down her mending, her heart beating faster at the tone in his voice. "It feels right to me, too." Thomas moved his chair closer to hers, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." She waited, hardly daring to breathe. "When Helen died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd had my chance at love and that was it. I never expected to feel—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I never expected to feel like this again." "Like what?" Margaret whispered. "Like I want to share everything with someone. Like the sunset is more beautiful when you're watching it too. Like coming home means something again because you're here waiting." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes. "Thomas, I know I'm not the young man I once was," he continued, his voice urgent now. "I know I can't promise you the same kind of love I had with Helen. But what I can promise you is partnership, respect, and a love that grows from really knowing someone, really appreciating who they are." Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his work-roughened ones. "I don't want to be Helen," she said softly. "I don't want to replace her or compete with her memory. What I want is to be Margaret, and to have that be enough." Thomas lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. "It's more than enough, it's everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, both absorbing the magnitude of what had just been said. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Margaret, Would you consider marrying me? Not because you need somewhere to go or because I need a housekeeper, but because we've found something good together, something worth building on. Margaret felt joy bloom in her chest like the flowers in her garden. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I would like that very much. Thomas leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a gentle, reverent gesture that spoke of tenderness and respect. It was nothing like the passionate embraces of young love, but it was perfect for who they were and what they meant to each other. Their happiness, however, was soon tested. 2 weeks after their engagement, Helen's sister Victoria arrived unexpectedly from Denver. Margaret was kneading bread in the kitchen when she heard the sound of a buggy in the yard, followed by Thomas's surprised voice greeting someone. Victoria swept into the kitchen like a storm, her fashionable dress and elaborate hat, making Margaret suddenly conscious of her simple work clothes and flour-dusted hands. "So you're the woman Thomas thinks he's going to marry," Victoria said without preamble, looking Margaret up and down with obvious disapproval. "I'm Margaret Whitfield," Margaret replied calmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Victoria. Thomas has spoken of you." "I'm sure he has. I suppose he's told you all about Helen too, about how perfect their marriage was, how much he loved her." Margaret felt the barb but refused to let it show. "He's shared some beautiful memories, yes." Victoria laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "And you think you can just step into her place, take over her house, her husband, her life?" "I'm not trying to take anyone's place," Margaret said firmly. "I'm trying to build something new." "New?" Victoria's voice rose. "There's nothing new about a desperate old maid latching onto the first man who shows her kindness. Helen was barely cold in her grave when you moved in here, playing house and pretending to be something you're not." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand you're grieving your sister, but that doesn't give you the right to insult me in what is now my home." "Your home?" Victoria turned as Thomas entered the kitchen, having heard the raised voices. "Thomas, surely you can see what this woman is doing. She's taking advantage of your loneliness, manipulating you into thinking you need her." Thomas's face was calm, but his eyes were hard. "Victoria, that's enough. You're speaking about my fiancée, and I won't have her insulted in our home." "Your fiancé?" Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "Helen was your wife for 15 years, Thomas. 15 years of love and devotion, and you're ready to throw that away for some stranger who showed up at your door?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Thomas said quietly. "Helen will always be part of me, part of this place. But she's gone, Victoria, and I'm not. Margaret isn't trying to erase Helen's memory. She's helping me build a future that honors the past while embracing what's possible now." Victoria looked between them, her face flushing with anger and grief. "Helen would be heartbroken to see how quickly you've forgotten her." "Helen would want me to be happy," Thomas replied firmly. "She loved me enough to want me to live fully, not just exist in the shadow of what we lost." After Victoria left the next morning, still angry and unreconciled, Margaret found herself shaken by the encounter. She sat in the garden, supposedly weeding but really just trying to process the harsh words that had been spoken. Thomas found her there an hour later, her hands idle in her lap and tears streaking her cheeks. "She's right about some things," Margaret said without looking up. "I'm older than most women when they marry. I did show up at your door with nowhere else to go. Maybe I am just a desperate old maid who—" "Stop." Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Don't let her poison what we have with her grief and anger. Victoria loved Helen deeply, and she's not ready to see anyone else in her sister's place. That's her struggle to work through, not ours. But what if she's right? What if I'm just convenient and you're just lonely?" Thomas cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Margaret, listen to me. I was lonely before you came. That's true. But loneliness would have made me settle for anyone who could cook and clean. What I feel for you isn't about convenience or desperation. It's about the way you hum while you work, the way you get excited about teaching children, the way you listen when I talk about Helen without getting jealous or threatened. It's about how you make me want to be a better man, not just a less lonely one." Margaret leaned into his touch, feeling the truth in his words. I love you, Thomas. Not because you rescued me or because I need a home, but because you're kind and strong and you make me feel like the woman I was always meant to be. Then that's all that matters, Thomas said, kissing her softly. The rest is just noise. As they held each other in the garden, surrounded by the plants Margaret had nurtured back to life, they both understood that their love wasn't perfect or simple. It was built on loss and second chances, on middle-aged wisdom rather than youthful passion. But it was real and it was theirs, and that was enough to weather whatever storms might come. October arrived with crisp mornings and golden afternoons that painted the prairie in shades of amber and rust. Margaret stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the collar of her new blue dress. She had sewn it herself over the past month, working by lamplight in the evenings after Thomas had gone to bed. The fabric was simple cotton, but she had chosen a rich navy blue that brought out her eyes and made her feel beautiful, despite her 42 years. Today was her wedding day. Downstairs, she could hear Thomas moving around the kitchen, probably drinking his third cup of coffee while he waited. He had been nervous all week, not about marrying her, but about whether everything would go smoothly. He wanted this day to be perfect for her, and his concern touched her heart deeply. Mrs. Chen knocked softly on the door before entering with a bouquet of late-season wildflowers. "From the garden you planted," she said with a warm smile. "Helen would have loved that you're carrying flowers from her soil." Margaret accepted the bouquet gratefully, admiring the purple asters and golden sunflowers that had somehow survived the first light frost. "Do you think we're doing the right thing, Mrs. Chen? Marrying, I mean." The older woman studied Margaret's face carefully. "I think two people who care for each other and want to build a life together are always doing the right thing. Age doesn't matter when hearts are true." "But what if people think—" "People will always think something," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "The question is whether you and Thomas are happy, and from what I see, you both smile more now than you have in years." The ceremony was held at the small church in town, with Reverend Morrison performing the service. Margaret had worried that few people would attend, given the whispers that had followed their engagement announcement. But as she walked down the aisle on Mrs. Chen's arm, she was surprised to see the church nearly full. The ranch hands and their families were there, dressed in their Sunday best, and beaming with happiness. Several neighboring ranchers had come with their wives, people who had grown to respect Margaret during her months at the ranch. Even some of the townspeople had attended, including the doctor's wife and the banker's family. Thomas stood at the altar wearing his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his face bright with joy. When he saw Margaret walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears of happiness. She looked beautiful, not in the dramatic way of a young bride, but with the quiet radiance of a woman who had found her place in the world. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Reverend Morrison asked if they would love and cherish each other for better or worse in sickness and health, both Thomas and Margaret answered with voices strong and sure. They had already seen each other through difficulties. They knew what those vows really meant. Thomas's voice shook slightly as he repeated his vows. "I promise to honor you as my partner and my friend. I promise to share with you all my joys and sorrows, and to build with you a home filled with laughter and peace." Margaret's response was equally heartfelt. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to love not just you, but the memory of those you've loved before me, and to help you create new memories that honor both our past and our future." When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Margaret gently, a kiss that spoke of promise and commitment rather than passion. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and Margaret felt her heart swell with gratitude for these people who had accepted her and welcomed her into their community. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the barn and lanterns strung between the rafters. Mrs. Chen had worked for days preparing food, helped by several of the neighboring women who had insisted on contributing dishes. There was roasted beef and fresh bread, apple pies and corn pudding, and enough coffee to keep everyone talking late into the evening. Margaret moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and good wishes from people who had become her friends and neighbors. She was particularly touched when old Mr. Peterson, the most respected rancher in the area, pulled her aside. "You've been good for Thomas," he said gruffly. "Haven't seen him look this content since before Helen got sick. You've given him back his smile." "He's given me mine too," Margaret replied, watching her new husband laughing with a group of ranch hands across the barn. As the evening wound down and the guests began to head home, Margaret and Thomas found themselves alone on their front porch, still dressed in their wedding clothes but finally able to simply be together. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Brennan?" Thomas asked, taking her hand and running his thumb over the simple gold band he had placed there earlier. "It feels like coming home," Margaret said honestly. "Not just to this place, but to myself. I feel like I'm finally the person I was meant to be." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Not the same as with Helen, but good in its own way. Better than I had any right to hope for." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the vast prairie sky. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that awful moment at the train station to this perfect evening. She had learned that love didn't always arrive when you were young and beautiful. Sometimes it came when you were older and wiser, when you could appreciate it properly. The following months proved that their marriage was built on a solid foundation. They worked together seamlessly, Thomas managing the ranch while Margaret took care of the house and began planning the school they had discussed. Word had spread about their idea, and several families had expressed interest in sending their children. By spring, they had built a small schoolhouse on the ranch property, just as Thomas had promised. Margaret stood in the empty room, breathing in the smell of fresh wood and imagining it filled with children's voices. Thomas had insisted on real glass windows and a proper blackboard, spare no expense to give the children the best possible learning environment. "Ready for your grand opening?" Thomas asked, joining her in the schoolhouse on the morning before her first day of teaching. "More than ready," Margaret replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "I can't wait to meet all the children." The school was an immediate success. 12 children attended regularly, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Margaret taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic science, adapting her lessons to the realities of ranch life. She taught them about the plants and animals they saw every day, helped them write letters to relatives in distant places, and encouraged them to dream about their futures. Thomas often stopped by during his lunch break, officially to check on the building but really to watch Margaret in her element. She was a natural teacher, patient with the slow learners and challenging for the quick ones. The children adored her, and their parents were amazed at how much their little ones were learning. One afternoon, as Margaret was helping young Billy Patterson with his multiplication tables, she heard familiar voices outside. Through the window, she saw Thomas talking with a woman she didn't recognize, someone in an expensive dress who seemed to be asking questions about the school. Later, Thomas explained that the woman was a representative from the Territorial Education Department who had heard about their school and wanted to see how it was operating. She was impressed, Thomas told Margaret over dinner, said we were providing better education than some of the official schools in bigger towns. She wants to recommend our school for official recognition and funding. Margaret felt tears of joy gather in her eyes. Official recognition? That would mean we could expand, maybe hire another teacher eventually. It means you've accomplished something remarkable, Thomas said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. You've created something that matters, something that will make a difference in these children's lives for years to come. As summer arrived again, marking a full year since their marriage, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed. She was no longer the rejected mail-order bride sitting alone at a train station. She was a respected member of the community, a successful teacher, and most importantly, a beloved wife. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Thomas handed her a small wrapped package. "What's this for?" Margaret asked, surprised. "Our first anniversary is next month, but I couldn't wait," Thomas said, looking slightly embarrassed. I saw it in town and thought of you. Margaret unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, Thomas had written, "For recording the adventures of Mrs. Margaret Brennan." Margaret traced the gold lettering of her new name with one finger, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. "It's beautiful, Thomas, thank you." That night, she made her first entry in the journal. "Today I realized that fairy tales don't always begin with once upon a time. Sometimes they begin with train stations and rejection and broken dreams. Sometimes the prince is a quiet rancher with gentle hands and a patient heart. Sometimes happily ever after means building something together, day by day, choice by choice. I thought I was too old for fairy tales, but Thomas showed me that the best love stories begin when we're wise enough to recognize real treasure when we find it." Years later, that journal would be filled with stories of their life together,